So let's have a look at the Chilterns Chalk. What I'm going to do, I'm taking you back to the opening ceremony on typical Chiltern summer's day. It was absolutely belting it down with rain, August 2008. I've put this in because I was fortunate enough to be around when the tunnel, the Western Tunnel or the Bulldog Bypass was being built. I wasn't working on the site. Basically, I just wandered in and I expressed my interest in the chalk of the section as they started the excavation. And for the next 2.5 years, I regularly visited the site, sometimes to the annoyance of the guys working there. But we managed to log it and get a good understanding of what was being dug through. And this is just taking you back. Here we are as the tunnels were first being put in. They were cut and fill tunnels. They weren't bored through. So the whole section was excavated, the tunnels built, and then the chalk was backfilled on top of it. Let's go back a bit further. And this is before the tunnels were put in place. We're down into the lower part of the middle chalk here, what's called the New Pit Formation. And you can see there are some very rare flints, some scattered through there, but not the numbers of flints that we were seeing, say, down on the Eastbourne chalk, where you get the regular flints. Down here, they are very, very few. So not all chalk is the same. I think that's one of the things that we need to establish as we go through. The other thing I put in here, this was as the tunnels were being built, you'll notice that they've had to rock bolt this mesh onto the face on both sides. And if you look at the lines of flint running through here, you can see that they're offset in various places. There were a whole series of faults that they encountered, which weren't expected when they did the initial analysis and the investigation before they built the tunnel. But because of the faulting in here, the faces started to collapse in, and they had to mesh them to stop the chalk from collapsing. Now, this is quite critical to our understanding of the chalk in the Chilterns, and I will be coming back to this on a couple of occasions as we go through. Let's have a look at the chalk itself. Typical New Pit chalk. You can see very few flints. There were sponges in here that the silica for the flints may well have come from, but all they get to be very diffuse and broken. And all these sponge beds, you just see iron staining, and that's about it. But we do pick up these rare flint bands, and this is probably the lowest flint band in the middle chalk in this part of the Chilterns. There is nothing above it and below it for probably about 5 or 10 meters above it. But there is this solitary flint band down at the bottom. So we do find the flints, and the silica is being derived from those sponges. There are other sort of areas, other organisms that the silica could be derived from. People often quote the microfossil radiolaria as potentially providing silica for flints. If I say to you that I've been working as a micropaleontologist in southern England over the last, if I tally up, this is going to be embarrassing, just short, it's basically 50 years next year. And in that time, I found one specimen of a radiolaria, which was in a borehole in London. And there is one published account which comes from Hertfordshire. It comes from the Hitching Railway cutting in 1895. So radiolaria are not common in the onshore chalks, and certainly not at a level to provide the amount of silica that we'd require. So my gut feeling is that the silicas come from the sponges. And the flints themselves frequently follow organic traces, burrow traces. We get forms like these with Planulites and Zoophycus running through them. Zoophycus is a feeding trace. And if I show you this, the sort of typical flint would be a vertical flint, maybe 20 to 25 centimeters long. And then if you work out, as Richard Bromley did in this case, where the feeding traces would have gone, then it would have ended up on this sort of structure within the chalk. We also get other flints with biogenic markings on them. This is a thalassinoides flint, another burrow flint, but it's covered with planulites running through it. And similarly here, we've got flints which are thalassinoides flints, which Richard Bromley, when he was alive and working in Copenhagen, he took meters or cubic meter blocks of chalk and dissolved them out. And by dissolving them out, was left with these feeding trace burrow flints. So those are the sort of the majority of the flints that we see. And in fact, all those horizontal layers of flint that I showed you in that cliff down in the south coast, they're all following burrow horizons. We also see these levels, hard grounds. This one's from the Baldock bypass as well. These are, the easiest way to think of these, I guess, is like a fossilized sea floor. And as the chalk is beginning to harden, it starts to form nodules. And some of these nodules start to mineralize. And you can see a bit of green staining around some of these nodules. That's the iron mineral glauconite. And you've also got a sort of orangey brown tinge within the nodules themselves. And that tends to be calcium phosphate. That's apatite. So we're starting to see this mineralization and formation of nodules, but the chalk around them was still soft enough for organisms to burrow through. And again, we can see some of these crustacean burrows between the nodules, which is typical of the chalk rock through the Chilterns. So this was certainly present at the top of the hills where the Baldock bypass tunnel was put through. And I've taken this just to illustrate what the fossil content was like at the time. This comes originally from a book from Bill McCarrow from Liverpool called Paleoecology, or sort of, yeah, it's fantastic sort of book showing what illustrations of like fossilized environments. And this is the one for the chalk rock. You can see all the burrows running through here. There are echinoids burrowing through. We've got inoceramid bivalves. We've got gastropods. Important that we've got gastropods. A lot of these were algal grazing gastropods. And if we've got algae on the sea floor, then they were photosynthesizing, which means that in a clear sea, you're probably looking at water depths no more than probably around about 80 meters, possibly 100, but probably about 80 meters deep when during the formation of the chalk rock. We do see ammonites in the chalk rock. And in fact, there's a chunk of Lewis Isurus that came out of the Baldock section. So we do get ammonite in these sections as well. Not commonly, but they're definitely there. And right across in, if you like, the northern end of the Chilterns, this is Reed Quarry, north of Royston. We get the level of hard ground above the chalk rock, which is the top rock sequence. So the top rock is the last of the hard grounds before you get into the, if you like, the typical white chalk. But it's important that we understand how far-reaching these units are. And this is bringing you right the way down to, although it's, it should have been in yellow, but it's in blue, the Aston Rowan, the M40 cutting. These old photographs are the best ones because they pick out, you can see the level of the chalk rock running through the cutting. And there's the top rock along the middle of the face here, the chalk rock in the lower part of it. And you can even see the burrows and some of those nodular fabrics within the hard grounds and the top of the chalk rock. Now, Richard Bromley, who did a lot of this work, mapped the whole of this area and published this in the early 1980s. But we've used some of his data, such as this diagram here, to show how the chalk rock varies across the region. If you look at the Aston Rowan section with the M40 cutting going through, the chalk rock is a whole series of hard grounds sitting immediately on top of each other. There's probably 4 or 5 units compressed into about a meter of thickness. And as you come eastwards in towards the Misbourne Valley, past the Wye Valley in West Wickham, you can see how these units start to split apart. And in fact, instead of having this compressed unit over in Aston Rowan, Great Missenden on the Misbourne Valley, we've got something like 6 separate hard grounds, which we can correlate across. And this is what Richard Bromley did back in 1981. There's Aston Rowan, the M40, there's that compacted, condensed sequence. But as you come across westwards, there's the Misbourne section, then the section at Kensworth that we have in the quarry, Luton Airport, and then Hitchwood, Reed. This is going right away across at the top end of the Chilterns. And we can see that units disappear, such as this, which is the Reed Marl, this labeled RM there. In modern day parlance, this would be called the Caburn Marl. And you can see that it's really quite a thick unit at Reed. It's probably somewhere in the region of about 5 to 6 meters thick from the top of the chalk rock to the Reed Marl or the Caburn Marl. But as we track it through the section at Kensworth, then across into West Wickham, it actually just disappears within the chalk rock sequence. It is completely lost. So we are seeing considerable variation in thickness during the deposition of this chalk rock sequence. So we've got to account for that somehow, and that's something that we'll come back to. So this is what I've picked out. The chalk rock tends to sit around about the top of the Chiltern Escarpment. It's really quite an important point, this is, because I will keep coming back to, why are the Chilterns there anyway? You've got to ask yourself what is going on. And in fact, the chalk rock, that hard rock unit within the chalk, forms a cap, which is eroded back, but has almost prevented further erosion. And as we see it today, the chalk rock is actually running just below the surface of this section. This is the section at Dunstable Downs. And because of that capping, it means that the rest of the middle chalk is sort of subcropping, if you like, down through that scarp slope. So it's an important feature in the Chilterns, and it helps to form the edge of the scarp slope. So back into the Baldock bypass, there's the chalk rock sitting along the top there. We can follow it through. And as we come down, there's the Southern Marl through there. In fact, no, that may be there. No, that's the Caburn Marl. And as we get, there are more and more marl seams as we come down. But you'll notice there are no flints. Where we get chalk with, if you like, abundant marl seams, then you will not get flints, or very rare flints. The reason being that during diagenesis, during lithification, formation waters carrying silica that would eventually crystallize out to form flint never get the chance. The ions, if you like, of silica got absorbed onto the clay minerals, so the silica is tied into the clays. It was never free silica or free enough to form the continuous flint bands that we see in the younger chalk and in the chalk to the south on the south coast.